Good morning. I'm Adem Özyıldırım, Director for Economic Research here at the Conference Board. And this is the Window On webcast. And today's topic is the window on China's economy in times of trade turbulence. We have put together a great panel discussion for our viewers, and I'd like to welcome our audience. Thank you for joining us. China is always a big topic in discussions, both for economists and for others around the world. We are looking at turbulent times, especially with regards to trade policy issues. And here are some of the critical questions that we're going to be addressing today with our panel. What are the current trade dispute between the US and China implications for the trade dispute, and what are going to be the damage to China's economy? As you know, China is the second largest economy in the world, and it will really affect the global economy in terms of what happens there. Which sectors and industries are the most impacted, and what does that mean for multinationals? So our panelists work closely with businesses around the world, and there'll be a lot of interesting insights in terms of what multinationals are affected and how they might respond. What are the factors that are causing the long-term growth slowdown for China? And are these factors temporary or long-term? So we'll spend some time looking at those factors for the Chinese economic slowdown. And what are the policy responses that we can expect from China? And how should multinationals prepare for those policy responses as we head into 2019? So the economic growth slowdown for China has been underway for a while, and here at the Conference Board, we've been calling it the long soft fall for the Chinese economic growth. And in fact, in 2019, some of the slowdown might be bigger than expected, so that might come as a surprise to some. This is partly to do with the moderation in the global economic outlook that we've been projecting for the global economy. But there are other reasons for the slowdown to be perhaps a little bit larger than expected for China. It's not just about the global economy. There are a lot of reasons, and at the top of those reasons is probably the trade turbulence in global markets that is created by the disputes between the US and China. So let me introduce our panel, and we can jump right into the discussion. So today I'm joined by Harry Broadman, who is a former senior managing director at PwC. Good morning, Harry. Welcome. Great to have you here. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And Ken Dewaskin is also online joining us, and he is Senior Advisor for the Chinese Services Group at Deloitte. Good morning, Ken. Welcome.
Good morning.
Great to have you both online with us. And here in the studio, I'm joined by my colleagues from the Conference Board. Ethan Kramer-Flood, to my right, is Associate Director for China and Asia Programs at the China Center. Good morning, Ethan.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. And last but not least is my colleague Eric Lund, who is our Senior Economist for China Geoeconomics. Welcome.
It's great to be
Eric,
here.
great to have you here. So a couple of tips for those of you who are joining us to earn CPE credits from this webcast. We need to make sure that you're on the webcast with us for the duration of the full hour. So please type in your full name and email address in the space that's provided. You'll have pop-ups at random points throughout the hour. Just click to indicate that you're online, and you have to stay on for the entire webcast. The credit is only available for the live webcast. We like these to be very interactive webcasts, and there's a chance for you to put in your questions or comments on the bottom left corner of your screen. And as those come in, I will incorporate them into our conversation here online and in the studio. You can download the presentation to refer to it later on or share with your colleagues. There's a way to make the slides full screen if you want to see them more clearly, although we don't have a lot of slides because we really want to focus on the conversation, but there are a couple of slides that we're going to be showing you. At the end of the hour, we'd appreciate if you could fill out a brief evaluation so we can continue to improve these webcasts for you. So without further ado, let me jump into the discussion, and we're going to start with a poll question to our audience. And that poll question is, how well positioned is China to fight a trade war currently? And on your screen, you should be seeing 3 options for that. So this is not a good time is the first option. The economic conditions in China are weakening and it's not a good time. The second option is China has created huge economic diversity and a large growth potential. It will be able to withstand the trade war with the US. And finally, China is not only able to withstand the trade war, but they can also inflict serious damage to the US economy in the long term. So the responses are coming in here. Let's give our audience a little bit more time here. So the majority right now seems to be going with the top choice. Okay, let's close the poll. I think those are the responses that we get. So let's start with a response to what you see there. So a majority thinks that the economic conditions are weakening. More than 50% chose that. And it's not a good time to get into a trade dispute with the US. But there are some, about a third, who think the second option is that China's economy is large and diverse and is able to withstand a trade dispute. And a minority think that they can actually inflict some damage. So those are the responses, and I'd love to hear what our panel thinks about that. So let me start with Ken online. What do you think about the capacity of China to withstand the trade war?
I think.
Ken?
Oh, okay, good. Yeah,
Yep.
sure. I would generally agree with the polling outcome, but I think that so far China has done actually very well. If you look at the September export data, for example, into the United States, China had almost 17% growth in exports to the U.S. in September, about 14.5% export surplus globally. So far, the diversification strategy that China has been pursuing for both imports and exports does seem to be significantly softening the blow. I would add to that the realignment of the currency, which has offset a substantial amount of the tariffs so far that have been established by the U.S. So right now, things are going fairly well. On the other side of the coin, China has been able to target some very specific areas of U.S. imports, primarily soybeans and sorghum, but also LNG. And that is actually beginning to show some impact politically in the United States.
Right. So how about here in the studio, Eric? You're following what's going on with China's economy, and what do you think?
I agree with the poll and what Ken said for the most part. China's economy is slowing. It's having structural issues in terms of some of the level of debt and trying to sort of de-risk the financial sector. At the same time, the U.S. economy is performing relatively well. So this is it gives the U.S. the upper hand in this kind of a trade volatility. Export numbers have been stronger, or export numbers out of China have been stronger, as Ken mentioned. The extent to which that is a function of simply front-loading some of these contracts to get around perceived risks in terms of upcoming tariffs remains to be seen. So I don't necessarily buy into the trade numbers that have been coming out September and October, because I think they're biased by a lot of these front-loading of imports and exports.
And you always have to look at the longer-term trends.
Yeah, I think we need more data.
Yeah. And Ethan, what do you think? Does the U.S. have the upper hand?
Yeah, well, the U.S. by almost every conceivable quantitative metric does have the upper hand, and we're seeing that manifest. But really, these answers can all be true simultaneously. I mean, it's accurate to say that China's economy is at its weakest point in its modern era. They are in the most difficult sort of growth environment that they've ever been in, but that doesn't mean, and this is a really bad time to be in a confrontation with the strongest economy in the history of the world. That's all true, but that doesn't mean that it's going to destabilize China. It doesn't mean that they can't handle it. It doesn't mean that they don't have their own toolkit, and it doesn't mean that they can't hurt the United States during the course of this confrontation.
Right, right. So it's rare to have this much consensus among economists. So our last panelist here is Harry. What do you think when you see this poll question?
So let me spice up the answers a little bit. I certainly agree with Ethan that all of these answers are true simultaneously. I think one of the issues is to double click on these questions and ask who is China in these questions. And so, for instance, the last question, which says that China is able to withstand pressures but also inflict serious damage on the U.S. economy, I think one might ask the question whether or not the U.S. trade strategy vis-a-vis China is actually impacting the United States economy. Well, I think one thing that is important to point out is the Chinese are a very patient people, and they think very much in terms of the long term. But there's clearly a structural problem that has been ongoing for the last decade and a half in China. The trade war is not going to help, but that's not, frankly, the biggest source of China's growth slowdown problems.
Right, right. So let's move on into our discussion, and I have a follow-up question for Harry. So reducing the U.S. trade deficit with China, the bilateral trade deficit, curbing Chinese competition on the global markets, especially for the high-tech industries, and also protecting intellectual property are kind of given as the main reasons behind the current disputes between the U.S. and China. So in your opinion, Harry, what are the most important motivations for the disputes for the U.S.? Why is the U.S. doing this right now? And also, why is China not giving in yet? Why is there this big struggle between the two economies?
Well, let me take your last point first. As I just mentioned, I think that China has a very long-term perspective and frankly sees this trade war at this juncture as a blip on the screen, depending on what path it takes. I think the real problem that the U.S. and frankly other WTO partners are upset about with respect to China, and I think that's a very important point, which is that this is a multilateral phenomenon of the impact that China is having on the global economy, and the bilateral approach that the U.S. is taking is out of step with actual multinational supply chains and frankly the other trading partners who all share the burden. But I think the heart of the problem in China with respect to trade policy vis-a-vis trading partners is that, and I'll be very blunt about it, is that the Chinese have not lived up to their commitments under their WTO accession agreement in 2001. And it cuts across many different threads, not just intellectual property and not just protectionist measures with respect to tariffs, but it has to do with the ownership of the key backbone enterprises by the state and the relationship between the state-owned banks and the state-owned enterprises, which really are quite out of line with what one would expect from a member of the WTO in a market economy.
Thanks for your insights there. And Ken, you've also spent a lot of time in China. You know the Chinese business intimately. What are your reactions to that? Why is the U.S. doing that now, and what are the main motivations?
I think one thing we have to add to the very important factors that you listed, intellectual property protection, fair price for technology, trade imbalances, and all the other elements that are actually behind the broader consensus in the U.S. Are the political considerations in the U.S. One of the things about China is that in every presidential election, China rises as a political issue, really going back to the days of most favored nation debates. And particularly with this administration, creating a political narrative is almost as important as doing something, it seems to be almost as important as doing something that's really meaningful in terms of actual trade issues, trade and investment issues. I would add investment issues to that discussion. And if you think back to things like what happened with TPP, for example, prior to the election and after the election, none of that you could really describe as something that was a rational response to what TPP was. That whole narrative was kind of twisted in a bizarre way to make TPP seem like a strong pro-China initiative, when of course it wasn't. It was the exact opposite. So the political narrative is a really critical part of this, and I think that things like pre-midterm promises of tariffs increases and then reiterating that after tariffs, or after the midterms rather, we'll have to see what happens there. But the political environment in the U.S. and the president's continuous quest to keep his support base excited about this makes China a very easy target. So we've had this discussion for decades. We've reached a new stage in terms of implementing it, and I think that's more a political feature of the current administration. I'd say one more thing too is that China's response, I think, it's very challenging for China to respond to this, because while you can lay out the goals, better treatment for intellectual property, better acknowledgement of technology advantages, balance of trade issues, the U.S. has not made, as far as we know, very specific requests from the Chinese for how to get there. What sort of steps they might take from a policy perspective, what kind of steps they might take from a regulatory and implementation perspective that would move toward these goals. And I think it makes it difficult. You'd have to ask yourself, what kind of response could they make that would actually satisfy this administration? I think it's not very clear at all.
So, I mean, the trade issues, especially with value chains, are very complex. And if you're not kind of getting clear messages or clear direction into solution to problems, it becomes even more uncertain. So I actually have a follow-up question to both Harry and Ken. And that is that you've talked about intellectual property protections and the technology sector. Are tariffs the best tool to respond to some of the issues that U.S. businesses are having when it comes to operating in or with Chinese businesses? So let's start with Harry first.
No, I think you framed it exactly correctly, which is that tariffs are not going to do very much behind the border in any economy where there are trade frictions. And I think particularly in the case of China, where the issues that its trading partners have is really having to do with the fabric of the domestic economy and the social economic issues that underlie the control by the party of the state-owned enterprises and the state-owned banks. And I'm not sure that tariffs will be, therefore, a very effective instrument by any trading partner to induce remedies that I think most trading partners would say are necessary in order for China to behave like a market economy and a bona fide member of the WTO. And I don't think that this administration, as Ken said, has articulated extraordinarily well, or well at all, what it is that they really want, other than reducing the bilateral deficit. You have to ask yourself, what would Trump claim as a victory and pack up and go home? And I think the answer to that would be that the trade deficit, the bilateral trade deficit between China and the United States went down to zero. Even if that were to take place, very serious problems would remain.
And Ken, your reactions to that, the use of tariffs as a tool to address these problems?
Yeah, well, I agree with what Harry said. I think that's absolutely right. If you look at the unintended consequences of trade tariffs, we have some very good examples, say, going back to Harley-Davidson and now very recently with General Motors in the last couple of days. What you really get is MNCs reevaluating their situation in view of tariffs. I think many of them believe that the tariff situation is actually going to continue for some time. And they are looking at a couple of major changes in the way they do business. One, supply chain restructuring. Second, the relatively significant impact of Industry 4.0 changes in the way they do business at their manufacturers. And the growth in markets overseas, because markets in China, consumer markets in China, India, Malaysia, across Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, are actually likely to grow faster than consumer markets in the United States. So from the MNC sort of strategic viewpoint, they want to be able to manufacture close to markets, especially if there's a lot of protectionism and a lot of tariffs around the world. That actually implies that the unintended consequence of the tariffs will actually be the loss of U.S. jobs. We've seen examples of that now, rather than the creation of U.S. jobs, one of the major targets of this Chinese trade initiative on the part of the current administration. So if you consider the unintended consequences, you have to reach the conclusion that maybe tariffs could play a role in a broader, more comprehensive, and more well thought out initiative, but tariffs alone and the continued threat of greater and greater tariffs really isn't doing the job.
Eric, what do you think?
I'd add that the goal of using these tariffs to try to convince China to abandon some of its industrial policies as they relate to things like Made in China 2025, which are these sort of broad targets in terms of high value added sectors. The first tranche of tariffs that were really implemented were focused on capital goods and high-tech kinds of equipment. But if you look at the companies that are actually exporting these things from China, they're not domestically owned companies. About 70% of the exports that are coming out of the ICT goods sector in China are foreign invested in some way, shape, or form. So, using tariffs to sort of try to punish Chinese companies in certain sectors may have the unintended consequence of actually punishing European and American companies that are operating in the country.
It's a great point. And there's a follow-up question from our audience, is that, I think this is to Harry and Ken first. What do you think would be effective to have China take a different attitude towards the IP policies and market access with trade partners? What would work if tariffs are not the right tool? And Harry, let's start with you again.
So, I don't think there's much of an issue about which instrument is important. It's more in terms of who is going to be pressing China. And the roadmap for what needs to be done is pretty clearly laid out in their, as I said before, their 2001 accession agreement. But I think expecting that one country, even if it's the largest economy in the world, and sees the trade phenomenon with China as a bilateral matter and not enlisting a coalition of the other very powerful trade partners who are members of the WTO to deal with some of these bedrock issues, I just don't think we're going to get very far. But the roadmap is there. If you look at the WTO accession agreement published in 2001, it's pretty clear what the reforms are that China agreed to. And if you waved a magic wand and those reforms are put in place now, which I don't think is going to happen, given the ascendance of the Communist Party, because those reforms would cut down its ascendance. If those reforms are put in place, we would have a very different kind of conversation with China in terms of trade policy and investment policy.
So before moving on to the next section here, I want to check in with Ken too. Any reactions to that in terms of effective policy tools?
Yeah, I think we have to add to the discussion of trade, investment issues, because investment is in many ways a major tool for technology acquisition, and you might even say technology rights abuse in China. And this is an area where the U.S. and most of Europe is actually in alignment. We've seen constraints on Chinese acquisition of technology through global M&A in both Europe and in the United States, especially in Germany in the EU context. So I think that very important considerations are twofold. I'd raise 2 points. One is the broadening of the definition of what national security is in all of China's trade and investment partners. We've seen this in particular with, say, the Huawei case is maybe the best example of this, where not only has the U.S. More or less persistently prevented major market entry by Huawei, but also now is encouraging its major trading partners to take a similar stand and to block the use of Huawei ICT equipment around the world. National security issues now extend to things like healthcare, biotechnology-related technology, as well as virtually everything in semiconductors, everything in remote sensing, signal processing, a whole range, artificial intelligence for certain, a whole range of those things that, Eric mentioned, Made in China 2025. These are top priorities for Made in China 2025. And now there's pushback on a lot of different angles to impede China's ability to access these technologies. So that I think is a major issue. And add to that the legislation we've had recently in the United States, the FIRMA regulations, which makes very significant changes in the way the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS, is able to stand up and prevent a wide range of technology acquisition and IP transfers to any place in the world. But of course, China's a major target of that. So these are steps outside of tariffs that I think are transformational, potentially transformational. We don't know how aggressively they'll be implemented in the future, but they are things to watch.
So let's start to move into the next section, and we're going to kind of dig into a little bit more about how these changes in policy and the responses are going to be affecting multinationals, which sectors and industries might be most impacted. And we'll go to an audience poll question again, and if we can get that poll up, we're asking the audience, the impact of the trade war on multinationals in China will be positive, neutral, or negative overall. So the three options are, a small number of industries will be impacted negatively, but as negotiations will proceed, the overall impact should be positive for MNCs in China. Or on net, it's minimal or neutral. And the third option is negative overall, even if some industries might benefit from this dispute. And most people, the majority is responding to the third option, negative overall, even if some industries will benefit. And nobody picks the positive option, although there's a minority that thinks there might be a neutral outcome of this. So I'm going to ask our panel to kind of respond to that question and what they see in the poll responses too. What's the impact on multinationals in China? So Ethan, let's start with you here in the studio.
So, this obviously is not a very controversial question based on our audience, but that might be based on who they are. Of course, this does follow the conventional wisdom that these types of operations tend to be lose-lose. That this confrontation has been going on long enough now that we have some evidence on the ground as to the relative truth of this. There has now been surveys undertaken by the various chambers of commerce, which do indicate a vast majority of business units of multinationals within China are responding that yes, in fact, they have been impacted negatively by the trade war, trade confrontation, whatever you want to call it. I think it's 75% or so report some sort of a negative impact on their business, mostly ascribed to simply increase in costs. We haven't seen as much of a proliferation of what many feared would be soft retaliation by the China regulator. As this tariff back and forth got rolling, many folks in our position and many multinationals were concerned that once China ran out with its ability to retaliate with counter tariffs, that it would begin to undertake a comprehensive campaign of soft retaliation via regulatory channels in the way that we know China can do. There is anecdotal evidence that some of that has been happening, delayed customs processes, et cetera. But it has not revealed itself in any sort of wholesale way as of yet, which is good news. So I guess I'm taking into step two, the impact of the trade war on MNCs goes beyond simply the trade war. It goes to the overall relationship and how American companies or all foreign companies are being treated inside China. So far, we haven't seen any sort of universal step in the wrong direction. There has been some at the margins, as I said, but in other ways, companies have actually found themselves even more welcome.
So Harry, what do you think about the impact to MNCs in China?
No, I certainly agree with what was just said. I think the issue is we can't look at this sort of in a static framework. Yes, I think in the short run, MNCs in China, depending on where they export to from China, clearly will be hurt in the long run, in the short run. But in the long run, there's going to be an incentive to perhaps move out of China, and whether that benefits the MNCs who might locate, let's say, throughout the ASEAN is a different matter. But this gets back to the point that was just made, which is the Chinese view the impact of the tariffs as a way of trying to woo, particularly exporters into the U.S. from China, to stay in China and offer them sweeteners to mollify the otherwise negative effects that the U.S. imposed tariffs on Chinese exports to the U.S. is having.
Thanks, Harry. And back in the studio, Eric, what do you think about the impact on MNCs and your reactions to what you're hearing?
I think it completely depends on the MNC. If you have an MNC that's producing in China for other markets, they're possibly affected in terms of their exports to the U.S. You have an MNC that's producing for domestic consumption. They're going to be less impacted by U.S. tariffs. But they could see the price of their inputs go up if they're sourcing materials from the U.S. So I don't think we can make a broad statement about how tariffs impact MNCs, because I think it really just depends on what kind of a company we're talking about, what they're producing, and who they're producing for.
So it's really much more of a case-by-case.
It has to be. Yeah.
Look at the companies, and you've been doing some work with the sectors that might be affected, which we'll get into a little bit later in the webcast. So just as a teaser for our audience, we'll come back to this impact by industry. But Ken, so you've spent a lot of time in China, and how do you see the trade dispute playing out for multinationals there?
I think Eric has hit on a very key point, which is to say that multinationals manufacturing in China see that as a hub for global exports, global market targets, and not necessarily all to the United States. So it's just a very interesting third-party report about iPhones, because Trump himself raised that as a possibility for a future significant tariff increase. And this report made one point, and that point was that with the change in the minimum V value, other factors, even a 25% imposition on the import of that kind of technology equipment from China would not actually motivate companies to move the manufacturing to the U.S., where they estimate that a 25 to 35% increase in costs would be incurred. And that really doesn't, that's strictly, again, back to Eric's point, that's strictly about imports into the U.S. The reality is that multinationals manufacturing in China, whether consumer electronics, industrial electronics, almost every category, are shipping worldwide. So you would have to do a much more complicated, much more comprehensive analysis to make the argument that tariffs into the U.S. market would really drive them to radically alter their supply chains. That's one thing. In terms of retaliation, though, I think there are risks. I agree with what Ethan said, is we haven't really seen this unfold yet, but some of the MNCs I talked to are beginning to see the front edge of this. And we have had authorized, you might say, Chinese spokesmen stand up and say things like, well, we could actually curtail the export of rare earth elements to other markets in the world that depend on these. That would be Japan and the United States primarily. So there are other means, you might say, avenues of soft retaliation, in addition to various regulatory moves that Ethan made reference to. And in many ways, I think from the standpoint of the bully pulpit, you might say, the Chinese senior officials are beginning to do what the United States administration is beginning to do. And that is lay out some potential future moves that they might undertake if this situation is not resolved.
So there may be some unintended consequences and sort of knock-on effects as we move into the future as this plays out. So a follow-up question to Harry is, where would you expect to see the most disruptions in China, in which sectors, but also do you see some shifts happening to perhaps some other emerging economies in the region?
Well, it's interesting on the latter point. There have been a couple of surveys that, frankly, are perception-based rather than data-driven, but nonetheless seem to indicate that the trade frictions, at least with respect to exporters to the U.S. from China, may be motivating them to think through about their location strategies, maybe not necessarily shutting down existing production lines or service facilities, but add-ons or other kinds of investments that they might make into China. And I do think the point that Ken made, and I think the rest of us are making about looking at this not just from an export-import lens, but through an investment lens. And I think that those two are inexorably linked. And policy can't focus on trade alone or investment alone. That it's got to really look at both of those together. In terms of the sectors where there's the greatest impact, at this point it's pretty specific to what the tariffs are aimed at. I think with respect to Chinese firms, it's going to have a potentially wider effect depending on what kinds of relationships they might have with respect to Chinese importers of soybeans, for instance. There are going to be therefore negative effects with respect to Chinese firms, but they would be the result of cascading effects, however large or small, tied to the firms in China that are buffeted by the U.S. tariffs on imports.
Thanks for those insights, Harry. That's very interesting. Eric, you've been doing some research into sort of input-output relationships across countries and industries, and you brought some slides. We'll put up those slides, and maybe you can briefly speak to those about which economy is most vulnerable and which sectors are getting more affected.
Sure. So for the last year or so, the Conference Board has been doing some really interesting data work involving global value chains and trying to sort of reframe the way our members think about international trade. Traditionally, most policymakers and business executives are looking at gross trade statistics. So, top line exports and imports and the resulting trade imbalance that falls out of that. But what we've been able to do is really try to identify where value is created and where it's ultimately consumed. The advent of global value chains in the 1990s and 2000s really just changed the way trade is shaped. And so you really need to look at value-added exports and value-added imports to try to get a better sense of what kinds of exposures and connections there are. So in the slide, what we're looking at here is a breakdown of essentially China's overall economy, sector by sector. So each one of these categories represents a large sector inside of China. Manufacturing, mining, and quarrying, et cetera, and the totality of all these is representative of China's overall economic output, or GDP. So for the one that we're looking at right now, this is basically a snapshot of China's economy. It's a couple of years old, but I still think it's fairly accurate. Overwhelmingly, China's economy is manufacturing oriented. About 1/3 of overall value created inside of the country is ascribed to the manufacturing sector, which is why it's such a big bar that you can see on the chart. Now, there are 3 different colors on the bar. There's gray, which represents the value that is produced by that sector that's actually consumed domestically inside of China. The red component is the value created inside of China that's ultimately consumed in the United States. And the blue is the value that's consumed in the rest of the world.
So the reds are much smaller.
The reds are much smaller, but it's a big world. For instance, in the manufacturing sector, about 6% of China's overall manufacturing value is consumed inside of the US, 24% in the rest of the world. So that's about 1/3 in total of manufacturing output that's consumed outside of the country. So that's a very large exposure point. Manufacturing is 1/3 of the economy. 1/3 of its output is consumed overseas. So just through that one avenue, that's 1/9 of China's economy that's exposed overseas. Within manufacturing itself, I don't have the slide in this deck, but we can actually look at sort of the subsectors within manufacturing that are most exposed, and a lot of it has to do with the higher value curve kinds of activities like ICT goods and things like that. So in respect to the U.S., about 3.1% of China's overall economy is dependent upon U.S. consumption. If you go to the next slide, I show a similar breakdown for the U.S. economy. And I'm not going to go into all the details here, but the degree of dependence through this framework of the U.S. on China is only about 0.7%. So China's exposure to the U.S., 3.1, U.S. exposure to China, 0.7. Again, just through value-added trade. Shows that there's a fairly large asymmetry in the dependencies, and I think that's underpinning part of the volatility in the negotiations that we're currently seeing.
So in all of this, you really have to look beyond the headlines and look under the hood a little bit to see the disaggregated.
Well, I mean, trade is not what it was 20 years ago, and so you need a new way to look at it.
So Ethan, you speak to a lot of our China Center members, which are mostly MNCs in China, and anything that you see here that surprises you based on some of the conversations you've had?
No, well, we're all familiar with this data, but I think I want to go back to the implication that is suggested by this data is that China is much more reliant on the U.S. and vice versa, and then that informs our thinking about how this trade war is going to turn out, right? The idea is, okay, both sides are feeling X amount of pain. Who can take the pain longer, and therefore that will help us understand who is going to blink, thus leading to some potential resolution down the line. And these numbers pretty much universally suggest that China is in a more difficult position. I don't think anyone argues with that. But of course, there's more to the conversation than just the quantitative figures. And earlier today, you asked a sort of two-part question about what's driving this confrontation. Why is the U.S. starting it, and then why is China resistant? And the panel did a great job unpacking the U.S. position and everything that the U.S. is doing. And I don't think we've dived quite as much into the motivations behind China, because although they are more vulnerable and they already are feeling pain, the U.S. is feeling pain too. Right? Many businesses, industries, and sectors are feeling pain. In China, it's become worse because of the business confidence issues. But the reality is that China is at the table. China has always been willing to compromise and always has been willing to offer concessions. China wants this to go away. Right? There is no doubt that the fact that this is continuing is because the U.S. has not gotten what it wants yet. China offered a fairly comprehensive and impressive set of concessions back in the spring, actually, that many of us thought wasn't even credible, and it was rejected by the U.S. side, and they seem to have reoffered much of that the same recently. So the U.S. is driving this confrontation. China does want to, I mean, they're at the metaphorical table. There hasn't actually been very much conversation, but China has for a long time wanted this to go away, and they're willing to offer concessions because they're not interested in taking this pain. They would prefer to find some way out. But again, it's not as simple as that either. Simply asking how long can China take the pain ignores probably a more fundamental question that we've sort of danced around earlier, which is whether or not they can actually even afford to offer the kind of concessions that the U.S. is looking for. So this is a more interesting way to think about it. The demands, the extensive structural demands that are on the table from the U.S. side, all of which are perhaps justified from the industry perspective and political perspective, may be far beyond what China is even capable of delivering on. In other words, the pain of suffering through this confrontation might be better than the pain of actually giving in. The whole edifice of the Chinese economy that relies on subsidies, structural advantages, IP infringement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is holding it all up.
Right.
So
right.
in the event that they were to offer these kind of concessions, they may not even be able to.
Let's not forget that, as you bring up, this is really happening in the broader context of transition of the Chinese economy to slower growth. And we're moving into the next section, again with a poll question to ask, what are the factors that are causing the slowdown in the Chinese economy, and whether these might be temporary or longer term. And in this case, we have a lot of options here, but you should be able to select more than one, up to three. So you'll be able to click on three different factors as to what is the most important factor behind China's current growth slowdown. So the answers are coming in. We'll give them a few more seconds to distribute their choices. And the other options, as you see there, are overinvestment and slow productivity. It's a slow transition to a consumer-led economy, slow global growth, so external factors, the US-China trade war and poor economic relations with other partners, the aging populations. Demographics is very important for economic potential. Or one factor that's outside of economics somewhat is domestic political or policy problems, which did actually get a lot of selections. Let's close the poll. The distribution is maybe not too surprising. The first two, overinvestment and slow productivity and a slow transition to consumer economy, get the most votes. And that's followed by domestic political or policy problems and an aging population, demographic problems, which are maybe impossible to change in the short term. And that gets followed by the slow global growth, the external factors. I'm a little bit surprised by that last one, that the slow external environment doesn't come up as an important factor for for the Chinese economy. Let me ask Harry about what you think about the external environment impact on China. Especially here, I'm kind of thinking about if the U.S. economy eventually slows down as the Fed raises interest rates to get ahead of inflation, what might that how might that impact for the Chinese economy as the U.S. and the global economy slows? Would they have the ability to counteract the effect of this trade war?
Well, I think as Ken mentioned, that as interest rates rise, it's going to strengthen the dollar, which of course weakens the RMB dollar exchange rate, which makes Chinese exports more attractive, which is going to therefore lessen the impact that tariffs are having. I think if there is a slowdown in the U.S., either because of interest rates, which I don't think is going to be the case in the short to medium run, but because of other factors in the U.S. economy, that we haven't invested enough in infrastructure, that we still, frankly, don't have an agreement about moving forward on enhancing productivity, dealing with environmental problems, gasoline underpricing, and the like. I think if the U.S. economy does begin to slow down significantly, that will in fact have an impact on China. But I think as the poll data suggests, which is frankly not surprising to me, a lot of the impacts on China are homegrown. And I think that is certainly my view, that as was said earlier, these are domestic structural problems, certainly illustrated by the overinvestment and punctuated by the demographic problems. And one of the ways that China has been trying to deal with overinvestment and excess production capacity is to export that excess capacity. Hence, Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road initiative, which, say what you will, I think does certainly help deal with the ossified state-owned enterprises and the export of their excess capacity to neighbors around the world.
Right. So here's a question from our audience that I think dovetails nicely with this discussion that Harry brought. How real is the growth of domestic consumption in China to help to maintain growth? Domestic consumption in China is often talked about, but how truthful is that? And Eric, you follow the Chinese indicators very closely, and what would you say to that?
So the question is about the growth in domestic consumption.
In China, right.
So some of the recent data has shown that consumer confidence inside of China has been reported to be relatively strong, which is supportive of sort of the narrative that consumerism is rising and helping to offset, a movement away from manufacturing and things like that. But if you look at some of the retail sales data, especially recently, it doesn't necessarily dovetail with the strength that you've seen in the consumer sentiment. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. I'm not sure whether there's the reality of what people are doing at the cash register versus how they're responding to a poll is the same thing. But clearly there's some sort of a problem with those numbers not matching up. It's a long-term process. It takes many years to achieve. Yeah, the consumer story is there, but it's taking quite a while to really embrace fully.
And maybe the problem is consumer spending may not be growing as fast as people expect or hope.
Sure. Right. Oh, I mean, especially when you have an aging demographic. You have parents that are relying on their children for support and things like that. It doesn't erode at your ability to go out and spend, maybe as much as you'd like to.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then another question to follow up on that, and Harry also mentioned the more domestic homegrown issues that China is struggling with. This is related to that. There's been a lot of coverage regarding increasing debt in all sectors in China. And as the economy slows, how will the debt issue unfold in terms of the long-term risks that are arising for the Chinese economy? First, Ken, and maybe Harry, you'd like to respond to that too. Ken, have you been looking at this issue of debt in China recently?
Yeah, of course. This is a really serious consideration. 30 trillion US dollars in sort of acknowledged formal debt. Recently, another 32 trillion US dollars in debt that probably exists in the total social financing world. But I actually want to go back for 1 second to the list that we just put up, because I certainly agree with both of the top two vote winners from the audience. But I would actually tend to cast my vote on other. And I think the elephant in the room that we're not talking about is a very, very significant reversal of some of the core policies that have been successful for China's remarkable economic development since economic reforms began in, say, 1980. And just to take a minute to talk about this, Deng Xiaoping made as a very critical point 2 things. One is that China needed strong institutions that were not political. And that political appointments at the top of the party and the government had to be term limited. 2, he popularized a slogan that called for the separation of politics and business, politics and industry, politics and commerce. If you think about the last 1 year of Xi Jinping's reign, we've seen a 180-degree reversal of this. I think it's extremely impactful on what's going on in China and certainly impactful for the near future. And I'll give you 4 examples. China's economy is re-centralizing. It is re-socializing. And what has been the engine of growth, which is both foreign participation and the domestic private economy, is in a sense under attack. We've talked a lot about how the foreign investment community is under attack. Let's take a look at what's happening in the private sector. Xi Jinping has said a number of things in the last year. One is he has reasserted and repeatedly and in uncertain terms, the importance of the party's role in managing the economy, and been very specific about sending more party people into major state-owned enterprises, having more party activities, both not only state-owned enterprises, private enterprises, and foreign enterprises in China. That's happening. That is happening. Secondly, he has reasserted in no uncertain terms and repeatedly that state-owned enterprises will be the pillar of the economy going forward once again. And we're seeing state-owned enterprises in areas like basic telecommunications, for example, trying to figure out how they can move into the more lucrative sectors that have been occupied by ICT-enabled industries like e-commerce and online financial services. Three, there is a growing uncertainty in China about the security and inviolability of private wealth. And even though the Constitution, Article 13, guarantees the inviolability of private wealth in China, you can cite at least a dozen examples just the last couple of months where this does not seem to be the case. Certainly, people I talk to do not feel very, very secure. And the fourth, and I think very interesting development, is we've had these recitations just in the last couple of weeks of major private entrepreneurs in China standing before CCTV television cameras and declaring both their deep belief in the communist system and their fealty to the Communist Party. So in a way, my choice for that list would be other, because I really think that something very profound is happening in the basic concept of how to continue China's reform process, and it is a very significant reversal of what we've had for the last 30 years, 35
Very
years.
interesting. I think, Ken, you're telling us to look beyond just the economic factors and consider kind of the political economy and beyond as well. So in the interest of time, we're kind of getting into the final 5 minutes or so. I'm going to move on to our final section, which is kind of starting to look ahead. What policy responses can we expect from China? And again, we have a poll question there to go to our audience, and then we'll wrap up with responses to that. So how long will the US-China trade confrontation will last, and how long will the disruptions last for MNCs? And the options are the main issues will be resolved in the next 6 months, and business will get back to normal. Or policy constraints will remain in place for the medium term, next 1 or 2 years, before pain will force a reconciliation. And the third one is a long-term look at the impact. Tariffs and protectionism are the new normal, and this fight will extend into the long term, beyond 2 years. So looking at the responses, I think the middle, medium term is getting the most response there. The majority go with the medium term for 1 to 2 years. But there's a number of people, about a fourth is picking the last one, which is this is the new normal, will last for the long term. And a few people picked the first, looking at the next 6 months for a resolution. Maybe you can wrap up your comments in 1 minute or so. I'll start with my colleagues in the audience. And Ethan, what do you think about the outlook for this trade dispute?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like sentiment has become a little bit more pessimistic than probably it would have been 6 months ago, when there was still some hope in the air that all of this was just a show of rhetoric, and that we were going to avoid any real pain. I guess the pain is already here. It's already happened. So now folks are starting to swallow the idea that it might actually take a while. We don't know. It might not actually take that long. I was also reading the way that we worded, and it might have been my fault wording this question, the idea that tariffs and protectionism will be the new normal. Of course, on the China side, protectionism with Chinese characteristics has already been the new normal for a very long time, right? So it's more that the U.S. has just sort of joined the fight and is now behaving in a similar way against Chinese trade as well as business interests in the U.S. I would probably vote more for number 2 as well, regardless of the outcome of the G20 meeting in just a couple of days between the two. Even if some positive signals come out of it, I wouldn't anticipate that means that anything is going to get solved. Really, I mean, if you think about how long it took to negotiate the new NAFTA, that's a year of constant talk in order to get a deal. And the US and China haven't started talking yet. So even if they agree to start serious discussions this weekend, all of the existing barriers could be in place for a whole year.
So a good prediction is we'll still be talking about this by the end of 2019.
Almost certainly.
And Eric, how about you? What do you think about the outlook?
I think there's a lot of layers to the confrontation that extend just beyond tariffs and trade. As Ken mentioned earlier on, with FIRMA and investment sort of aspects of the problem, those are ongoing. So I think the solutions are going to depend on what part of this confrontation we're talking about. If we're just talking about the surface level sort of tariffs and things like that, I think that there's more of a higher probability that can be solved over the next 6 to 9 months. But if we're talking about disagreement over sort of techno-nationalism and investment issues and who's going to be the leader in artificial intelligence and biotechnologies in the future, which is also a big part of this dispute. Those are issues that are not going to be solved in the short term to medium term. China sees these as being fundamental to their continued economic development, and the U.S. sees these industries as being really the cornerstone of American economic welfare. And so there really isn't going to be any agreement on that.
Right.
So it depends on how you ask that question. I think the tariffs could be solved a bit more quickly than some of these other aspects of the disagreement.
Right. And Ken, how about you?
Yeah, I would build on what Eric just said. I think that I'd make two simple points. One is what we're calling normal here is something that we've lived with for maybe 16 or 17 years, really, since China joined the WTO. There's a much longer normal that is unfolding. So point one is that I'm not sure what normal is, actually, and what we would return to if we return to normal. Secondly, I think that you really have to consider the possibility that some of these changes are permanent, and whether the tariffs themselves, specifically as a policy implementation program, whether they remain or not, doesn't change the fact that I think we have to consider the possibility that these are permanent long-term changes that are unfolding now. And again, just to build on what Eric was saying, the redefinition of national security itself, with a much stronger focus on economic matters, technology control. Technology control itself has huge political implications. If you don't control technology, you can't implement sanctions globally against countries that you consider to be adversaries. So technology control, innovation capability, and the ability to control the most valuable parts of supply chains, I believe these things are under permanent change dynamics and pressures that basically argue that there's no actual new normal to return to.
So Ken, it sounds like you're expecting some major changes, and so last but not least is Harry. Do you expect those changes to be the new normal going forward in the long term?
Well, I think if you put on your USA hat, what this administration would frankly claim as a victory, as I said earlier, is if the trade deficit, the bilateral trade deficit, went to zero. And so in the second polling question, a reconciliation, if you interpret that as in terms of the US's main measure of winning or losing, and that is the size of the bilateral trade deficit, that could end, yes, within the next 1 to 2 years. But that, as I've said and others have said, that is just the tip of the iceberg. And I would take issue with the fact that the U.S. has actually been systematically pressuring China to deal with these much deeper behind the border issues. I just don't think that they're willing to do that, and I don't think they have the tools to do that. And even with respect to CFIUS, on which I sat when I was in the White House, that is still another sort of game of whack-a-mole of trying to take a hit at China sort of non-systematically on the investment side. But as I say, the problem really is a multilateral one. And as long as the U.S. continues to pursue a bilateral path, yeah, we could certainly get a reconciliation and wipe away, at least temporarily, the merchandise trade deficit, which is what Mr. Trump is focused on. But I think the notion that we're going to solve with the Chinese the control of the party, as I said before, the state-owned enterprises and the state-owned banks, I just don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon.
Thank you very much, Harry, and I'd like to thank all of our panelists. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but perhaps we should have you come back in 6 months or so and to kind of revisit the new normal and how the new normal or the normal might be shaping up. If you've enjoyed this Windows On webcast, there's a whole series for the 2019 that you can sign up for, and the series is moderated and hosted by our chief economist, Bart Van Ark, as you see there. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today on the window on China and trade disputes and the impact of on the Chinese economy. And see you next time in 2019. I'm Adama Özilder with the Conference Board.